Chapter 1. The Soft Echoes of Philadelphia. The city rested beneath a heavy sky where the hum of streetcars faded like a lullaby. It was the kind of night where silence didn't come in sudden stops. It settled gradually, like a curtain drawn at dusk. Lights glimmered in quiet windows. The Delaware River, calm and indifferent, traced its way through the dark. On a narrow street just past 9th and Snyder, the gentle tap of shoes against wet pavement barely disturbed the peace. And in that stillness, Philadelphia slept. This was the world that would shape a man called Angelo Bruno. A boy, really, born in Villalba, Sicily, brought across the Atlantic in 1910 to seek a new life in America. His real name was Angelo Annaloro, but that name would melt into something more fitting for the quiet power he would one day hold. In the Italian neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, survival was not given, it was learned. Brick row houses, corner stores with fresh bread and canned tomatoes, women sweeping stoops, men speaking in low voices at dusk. For young Angelo, there were lessons everywhere. You watched the ones who walked slow but were never questioned. You listened to the ones who didn't talk much but were always obeyed. Angelo was not flashy. He wasn't the type to throw punches for no reason. He was quiet, reserved, respectful, and in the underworld of the early 20th century, those qualities were rare and valuable. He started small, bookmaking, numbers, handling packages, but unlike others hungry for attention, he kept his head down, watched, waited. It was a time when cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were becoming theaters for something much bigger than the usual street corner rackets. Men from Sicily and Naples were carving out empires, and Angelo, young, patient, unnoticed, was taking mental notes. By the 1930s, as Prohibition's haze was lifting, Philadelphia's underworld had begun to take a new shape. Bosses came and went, violence ruled, but some men believed power could be built without noise. Angelo rose not through fear, but through favor. He did favors for others, never asked for much. But every man he helped remembered. That kind of capital lasted longer than muscle. While others shouted to be heard, Angelo whispered and was followed. His presence grew like ivy, quietly, consistently, not disruptive but permanent. In a world of short tempers and long grudges, Angelo Bruno was the calm in the storm. And though no one quite saw it yet, a foundation was being laid, one that would carry him to the top of Philadelphia's criminal structure. And as the wind passed over the rooftops of South Philly that night, as dogs lay curled behind fences and neon signs buzzed themselves to sleep, the city rested unaware of what was beginning to stir. A soft rain was coming, not with gunfire or brash proclamations, but with handshakes in silence, eyes that missed nothing, and a man who would one day be called the Gentle Don. Chapter 2. A young man in a grown man's world. The 1940s moved like a slow breeze through Philadelphia. The war overseas pulled young men into foreign trenches, but back home the streets remained loyal to their own battles. Italian cafes buzzed quietly with backroom games. Flower shops doubled as meeting halls. Barber shops whispered secrets in low tones over the snip of scissors. Amid all this, Angelo Bruno became a man not by age, but by responsibility. He worked under the guidance of established figures, capos who had seen more winters than smiles, men who remembered the old country like a wound they never spoke of. They took to Angelo because he didn't talk too much. He didn't brag. He asked questions, but only when the timing was right. He delivered envelopes, sat in on card games, not to play, but to watch. If someone owed, Angelo collected, not with fists, but with words that cut sharper. In a world where ambition often burned too bright, Angelo was a low flame. He burned steady, the kind of man who could walk into a room and leave everyone guessing what he was thinking. That made him dangerous, but in a quiet, calculated way. In a street culture where respect meant everything, Angelo learned the balance. He never disrespected a made man, never stepped over an elder, yet he never let himself be stepped on either. He married, raised a family, and kept his personal life untouched by the dirt he walked through daily. This dual life, the loving father and the disciplined mobster, would become part of his legend. A man who could eat dinner with his wife and children, then slip into a smoky back room to decide someone's future with a nod. He didn't live loudly, he lived precisely. By the end of the decade, he'd aligned himself with the most powerful figures in the Philadelphia mob. He became a trusted advisor, not a killer, not a muscle man, but something more rare, an ear people spoke into, a mind they relied on when tempers flared. Angelo knew violence had its place, but he also knew violence was loud, and loudness brought heat. Heat meant arrests, headlines, rats. He wanted none of that. Instead, he offered stability, diplomacy. When turf wars broke out, he brokered peace. When two capos couldn't agree, he found middle ground. It wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. The kind of wisdom that kept bodies out of the river and books in the black. He understood that a city like Philadelphia didn't need another hothead with a Tommy gun. It needed someone who could walk both sides of the line, someone who made the rules look optional, but never ignored. Angelo's approach began to set him apart. Men who had once dismissed him as soft began to see the advantage in his methods. He rose not through fire, but through frost, cold, calm, deliberate. His reputation stretched beyond city limits. New York took notice. So did Atlantic City. He became known as a man you could trust until you gave him reason not to. As another year closed and snow dusted the city in silence, Angelo stood on his porch, hands in his pockets, looking out at the street he'd known for decades. The city slept. So did his children. But in the darkness, power shifted gently toward the man who never chased it, the man who let it come to him. Chapter 3. The Quiet Seat at the Table. By the early 1950s, the Philadelphia underworld was no longer a scattered patchwork of local gangs and half-formed crews. It was becoming structured, disciplined, modeled after the more refined operations out of New York. The five families up north had turned disorganized crime into a boardroom affair, and Philadelphia, smaller, quieter, was beginning to follow suit. At the center of this transition, almost unnoticed, sat Angelo Bruno. He didn't force his way into the upper circle. He was invited. When the old bosses needed someone to handle disputes without a body count, Angelo became the voice in the room that calmed storms. He didn't shout to be heard. He simply waited. And when he spoke, men leaned in. His influence didn't explode onto the scene. It seeped in like water under a door, slowly, permanently. The boss at the time, Joe Ida, was a more traditional figure, stern, Sicilian, and deeply rooted in the ways of the old country. He oversaw the city's rackets with a heavy hand. Gambling, loan sharking, and union control brought in steady money, but cracks were forming in the old model. The FBI had started paying closer attention. Wiretaps replaced whispers. Surveillance took the place of snitches. The days of careless violence were fading. It was a new era, and few understood that as well as Angelo did. He kept his crew small and loyal, men who knew better than to make headlines. He took his share quietly, reinvested wisely, and avoided unnecessary risk. Where others flexed for territory, Angelo focused on longevity. He believed that a smart man could do more in 20 years of quiet deals than a loud man could in 5 years of chaos. In 1959, Joe Ida fled the country to avoid prosecution. It created a power vacuum. Others in the family postured, made calls, tried to secure support, but the commission in New York had grown. Tired of instability in Philadelphia, they didn't want another war. They wanted order. So when the call came to approve a new boss, it was Angelo Bruno's name that rose without resistance. He accepted the role with the same calmness he carried in every room. No celebrations, no speeches, just a meeting, a handshake, and a nod. The new boss of Philadelphia would be a different kind of leader, not one to scream into the night or leave trails of blood through alleyways. Angelo would rule the city like a whisper in the wind, and that whisper would carry farther than anyone imagined. Under his leadership, things changed. The violence slowed, the books balanced. He discouraged drug dealing, not because it wasn't profitable, but because it drew too much attention. He preferred rackets that could operate for decades undisturbed. Garbage collection, construction, gambling dens hidden in the backs of bakeries. He wasn't interested in making noise. He was interested in building something that could last. Angelo Bruno had arrived at the top not by stepping on others, but by outlasting them. and as he sat behind his desk, the hum of the city outside his window, he understood the burden he now carried. Power, once obtained, had to be protected, and in a world built on trust, fear, and silence, there would always be someone listening, always someone watching, and always someone waiting for a single misstep. But for now, the city rested, and so did its gentle dawn. Chapter 4. The Business of Silence. With the city now under his watchful care, Angelo Bruno moved like a man with time on his side. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to be. His presence was already stitched into the fabric of Philadelphia's underworld, and those who once questioned his methods began to see the wisdom behind the quiet. He surrounded himself with a small circle, men he trusted, not just for their loyalty, but for their ability to understand subtlety. There were no grand meetings in candlelit restaurants, no parades of luxury. Angelo preferred back rooms with one entrance, conversations held behind closed curtains. His power was not in what he said, but in what he chose not to. He turned his attention to the unions, the docks, the trucks, the construction crews, all areas where cash moved freely, often without paperwork. If you controlled the unions, you controlled the flow, and if you controlled the flow, the money never stopped. But unions also meant politics, and politics required restraint. Angelo didn't threaten politicians, he befriended them. A favor here, a campaign contribution there, a handshake at a fundraiser. He never asked for more than a nudge, and that was all he ever needed. The city began to change under his rule. There were fewer street killings, fewer bodies found in car trunks. It wasn't that the mob had gone soft, it had grown smarter, and that was Bruno's greatest strength. He understood that peace wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a strategy, one that gave the family room to grow without attracting unnecessary attention. He also made sure that tribute flowed upward, not outward. His lieutenants brought him their cuts, and he made sure their pockets stayed full. There was no reason to rebel when everyone ate. He kept his hands clean, but his reach was long. He owned no storefronts, but every third business paid a quiet respect. He signed no leases, yet buildings changed hands at his word. His name never appeared on paperwork, but his decisions were etched in stone across the city's hidden economy. But even the most peaceful regime has its whispers. Not all in the family agreed with his resistance to drug money. The heroin trade was exploding, the profits enormous, and though Bruno believed it brought heat and ruin, others hungered for the wealth it promised. Men like Antonio Caponigro, a capo with ambition and a taste for more, began to quietly question the old ways. Still, for now, Bruno's grip held firm. He had the backing of the Commission, the respect of New York, and the fear of anyone smart enough to know what happened to those who stepped out of line. He traveled occasionally, dinners in Brooklyn, conversations in Little Italy, meetings that left no records. He walked with the bosses of other cities, not behind them. In New York, he'd once shared coffee with Carlo Gambino, and they spoke not of blood, but of balance, of men who ruled not by gunfire, but by thought. They were cut from the same cloth, leaders of quiet empires. And yet, back in Philadelphia, the tension in the shadows grew slowly, like ice forming beneath the surface of a still lake. Angelo noticed it. He always noticed things, but he believed in his system, in the logic of loyalty, in the weight of history. Outside his window, snow fell lightly on the streets. The night was calm. The city slept, unaware of the quiet cracks beginning to spread beneath its feet. Chapter 5. In the company of giants, far beyond the narrow streets of South Philadelphia, in the twisting heart of New York City's criminal machinery, another name stirred: Vincent Gigante. His was a presence not yet fully formed, but already marked by silence. His world was louder than Bruno's, filled with sharper elbows and faster betrayals. Yet there was something familiar in Chin's quiet path, something that would eventually bring their stories to intersect, like rivers destined to meet. Born in 1928 in Greenwich Village, Chin came from the same old-world stock. His parents were immigrants, honest people working long hours to raise 5 boys. But the streets offered something else, something quicker, something colder. Vincent didn't dive in fast. Like Bruno, he began on the edges. He boxed as a young man, fought in the ring under the watchful eyes of men who wore suits even on Sundays. But it wasn't fists they were interested in, it was obedience. Soon, Chin's life moved from the ring into darker corners. He started doing jobs for Vito Genovese, a man whose name alone could turn a room to silence. Genovese didn't tolerate weakness. He ruled with conviction, feared even among peers. For a young soldier like Chin, that loyalty would be everything. It shaped him, taught him that power wasn't in speech. It was in presence. It was in being where others didn't expect you, in doing what others wouldn't. But even in those early years, Chin was an oddity. He moved unpredictably, walked with a hunched posture, muttered to himself in public. There were whispers that something wasn't right, that he was touched, but the ones who said so never said it twice, because behind the glassy eyes and the slow shuffle was a mind like a steel trap, and Vincent Gigante knew exactly what he was doing. Back in Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno began to hear the name more often, New York Cap. O's mentioned the kid from the village, how he played the fool in the daylight, but at night he was something else entirely. Precise, unshakable, ruthless when needed, but never careless. He rose quietly through the Genovese ranks, earning respect not by ambition, but by effectiveness. Their worlds had not collided yet, but in the chessboard of American organized crime, every square mattered, every move rippled outward, and two men, so different in manner yet so similar in discipline, were slowly being drawn onto the same line of play. Chin worked his way into the inner circle. He protected Genovese during his legal battles, moved money, passed messages, avoided cameras. It was during these years that his eccentricities deepened. He began walking the streets in slippers and bathrobes, checked into psychiatric hospitals. Some believed he'd lost his grip, others knew better. Chin was building a disguise so convincing no one would ever think to look behind it. Angelo Bruno saw the strategy for what it was, and he admired it. Not many men had the patience to act powerless to gain power. It was a long game, one played by minds that saw through years, not weeks. Like Bruno, Chin was a man who moved best when no one was watching, and though they had yet to speak, both men lived by the same unspoken rule: the quieter you moved, the longer you survived. Chapter 6. The Weight of Loyalty. The 1960s had settled in like a slow exhale. In Philadelphia, the streets felt quieter, but quiet didn't mean peace. It meant control. It meant every man knew his role. Angelo Bruno had become more than a boss. He was the architect of calm in a business built on storms. The city thrived under his rule, not because he enforced fear, but because he enforced order. He met frequently with his capos, not in smoky diners or gaudy lounges, but in modest homes, over quiet dinners, behind drawn curtains. There were no recordings, no documents, just trust, the kind that took years to build and one mistake to destroy. Bruno didn't need to bark orders. He asked questions, listened carefully, and let others arrive at the decisions he had already shaped. That was his gift. He made men believe they'd found the answer, even when he had handed it to them. But power draws shadows, and not every shadow is content to remain in the background. Antonio Caponegro, known as Tony Bananas, had begun to stir. He was smart, dangerous, hungry, and unlike Bruno, he saw heroin as the future. The profits were enormous, the risk even greater, but Tony believed the gamble was worth it. Angelo, firmly opposed, had made it clear: drugs brought heat, and heat brought collapse. The commission in New York respected Bruno's stance. Men like Carlo Gambino had his ear, and his reputation was golden. A peaceful boss was a rare thing, and rare things were preserved. But inside the Philadelphia family, Tony saw Bruno's caution as weakness. He believed that a man unwilling to adapt would not survive the changing tides of the underworld. While tension simmered in Philadelphia, Vincent Gigante continued to build his strange empire in New York. He had now become a capo, quietly, carefully. He rarely spoke above a whisper, often seen wandering his neighborhood in a tattered bathrobe. He muttered to himself in the daylight, disappearing by nightfall. The act convinced many, but those who looked too closely saw the truth. Vincent was no madman. He was a strategist. His loyalty to Vito Genovese had carved him a seat in the Genovese family's inner chamber. And when Genovese was imprisoned, Chin didn't fall. He adapted, worked from the shadows, pulled strings no one could see. By the mid-60s, whispers had begun to surface. Chin wasn't just protecting the family's interests, he was shaping them, quietly moving toward the throne. Angelo heard these whispers during his visits to New York. Men spoke of Chin with caution, respect, curiosity. No one could quite understand how someone so visibly erratic held such consistent power, but Bruno understood. It wasn't the madness that protected Chin, it was the commitment to the role, the total immersion in a mask that let him operate unseen. In that way, Chin and Bruno shared a philosophy: concealment over conquest. Where others reached for fire, they built fortresses of fog. One played the gentle Don, the other the mad boss, but both were very much awake, very much in control. And as the 1960s crept toward their end, the underworld prepared for a shift. The old guard was aging, new blood was watching, and in Philadelphia the first cracks in Bruno's foundation began to widen. The streets still obeyed him, but not all hearts did. Chapter 7: The Quiet Game of Chess. In the winter of 1969, the air over Philadelphia felt still, but underneath the game was shifting. Angelo Bruno, now a seasoned boss, continued to rule without flash. His power was so embedded that he rarely had to assert it. Every man in the city's underworld knew where the line was drawn and who had drawn it. He no longer walked the streets like in the early days. His presence was now in subtle movements: an envelope passed at a funeral, a name whispered in a basement barbershop, a glance exchanged in a restaurant booth that told a man everything he needed to know. These were the languages of the life, and Bruno was fluent in every one. He had become the embodiment of balance, a broker of peace between crews, a bridge between tradition and modern business. Even law enforcement found themselves unsure how to pursue him. He was rarely photographed, never wiretapped, never quoted. He lived simply: a modest house, a quiet wife, Sunday dinners. His neighbors called him friendly, polite, the kind of man who waved from the porch and shoveled his own sidewalk. But behind those warm gestures lay decisions that shaped entire networks. The unions were still under his influence. Bookmaking and loan sharking remained his bread and butter. And while heroin flooded the markets of New York and Chicago, Bruno kept Philadelphia largely untouched by the trade. His refusal to greenlight narcotics in his territory won him admiration from the commission, but made enemies closer to home. Tony Caponigro continued to rise. He wanted more. He saw Bruno's restraint as outdated. Money was pouring in from heroin, and Caponigro wanted his share. He pushed boundaries quietly, setting up deals behind Bruno's back, moving product through neighboring states. And he wasn't alone. Others in the family, eager for larger cuts, began to murmur. The whispers had not yet turned into actions, but they were getting louder. Bruno sensed it. He always did. He spoke less at meetings, watched more, listened for silences between words. He began to test loyalties in subtle ways. A delayed envelope here, a changed assignment there, watching who responded with patience and who did not. Meanwhile, in New York, Vincent Chin Gigante had grown more powerful by pretending he hadn't. He continued to build his reputation as a lunatic to the outside world, checked into psychiatric clinics, missed court dates, wandered in mismatched clothes. But inside the Genovese family, he was becoming essential. He oversaw West Side operations, kept his crew in line, made decisions that echoed upstate and across state lines. His madness was no longer an act, it was a weapon, a shield, a costume so convincing that judges, agents, even rival families stopped looking at him as a threat. And while they looked away, he solidified his control. When Bruno heard Chin's name mentioned in hushed tones across dinner tables in Little Italy, he understood the brilliance of it. Power was safest when no one saw it coming, when no one knew where the real seat was. Chin had mastered that art, as Bruno had too, but in a different flavor. The gentle Don and the silent lunatic, each carving out power in their own controlled way. But power, no matter how carefully shaped, invites envy. In the quiet of that winter, Bruno knew he was being watched more closely, not by law enforcement, but by his own. Men who had once followed him out of loyalty now followed him out of habit, and habits in the underworld were often the first things to break. Chapter 8: A Storm. Beneath the floorboards, the early 1970s brought with them a shifting tide. The city itself remained still, its row homes lined up like soldiers, the sidewalks worn with the footprints of men long gone. But underneath, something restless moved. Angelo Bruno sat at the top of Philadelphia's criminal pyramid, but he no longer stood alone in his certainty. The order he had built, so carefully, so patiently, was starting to buckle beneath invisible weight. Inside the family, some capos questioned the future. Younger men came up through the ranks with different expectations. They saw the profits in heroin, saw other cities swimming in cash, and wondered why Philadelphia stood still. Bruno, consistent in his refusal, remained firm. But firmness invites challenge, especially from men who smell opportunity. Tony Caponigro was no longer whispering in corners. He was making moves, carefully, strategically. Meetings were held in quiet places. Trucks were rerouted. Cash flowed through new hands. To the untrained eye, it looked like business as usual. But Bruno saw the pattern, the subtle shift in attitude. Eyes that once lowered now held a second longer. Voices that paused just before calling him boss. The respect was still there, but now it walked with hesitation. And hesitation, in Bruno's world, was more dangerous than open rebellion. He met with trusted lieutenants more often, not out of fear, but out of preparation. Men like Phil Tester, calm and reliable, sat across from him in dimly lit dining rooms, discussing things in tones barely above a whisper. There was talk of New York, of allies within the commission, of who might be leaning toward Caponigro's camp, and who could be brought back into the fold. Meanwhile, in New York, Vincent Gigante continued to disappear into his madness. He had now avoided federal indictment multiple times, each one slipping past. Tilumsomat with the same method. Psychiatric evaluations, institutional stays, slow speech, empty stares. Judges found him unfit to stand trial. Prosecutors cursed under their breath. But inside the Genovese family, his grip was tightening. Gigante now had authority over vast operations, loan sharking, gambling, extortion, each run like clockwork from beneath the veil of instability. His underbosses met not in boardrooms, but in church basements, laundromats, and nursing homes. The police kept knocking on doors that led to nowhere, and while they chased shadows, Chin moved men like chess pieces, quiet, precise. He had little contact with Bruno directly, but they shared the same air. Both knew the importance of appearances, how they could be used, how they could be altered. Both had discovered that real strength doesn't demand to be seen, it simply is. Back in Philadelphia, Bruno still controlled the family on paper, still collected tribute, still made final calls, but he began to feel the distance growing between himself and some of his men. The language of loyalty had changed. Where once a nod was enough, now it required reassurance. Where once his presence calmed a room, now it stirred calculation. He had spent a lifetime avoiding unnecessary violence. It had been his code, his brand. But now, silence alone might not be enough. Some men, he realized, only understood noise. Still, he waited, watched, measured. That was who he was. He would not rush. He would not strike out in panic. Even as the floorboards of his empire began to creak, Bruno held to his principle, order over chaos, even if the cost would be his own peace. And outside, the streets of Philadelphia remained calm, the city unaware of the storm building slowly beneath its feet. Chapter 9. The Mask of Madness. In New York, the streets of Greenwich Village moved at their usual pace. Cafe lights shimmered against wet cobblestones. Laundry hung still in alleyways, and somewhere among them walked a man in slippers, muttering beneath his breath. Vincent Chin Gigante had become part of the landscape, ignored, pitied, written off. That was the plan. To the public he was no one, a sick man, a confused relic of another time. But inside the Genovese family, his word was law. He rarely spoke in public, almost never answered the phone. Messages were passed through layers of men, trusted soldiers who had learned to speak carefully and act without delay. No wiretaps, no paper trails, no recorded conversations. Chin had made sure of that. The madness, crafted over years, had become an armor. When authorities pressed, he folded into it. Psychiatric evaluations declared him paranoid, delusional. He claimed to hear voices, claimed to forget faces. but there was nothing forgotten about the way he ran the family's operations. Gigante oversaw rackets throughout New Jersey, Manhattan, and the Bronx. His lieutenants collected quietly, paid promptly, and kept things clean. He discouraged drug dealing, not because of morals, but because it invited attention. He had seen what the FBI did to families that got sloppy with heroin. He knew better. His wealth came from businesses with long legs, construction kickbacks, union skims, numbers games, all wrapped in layers so dense that even prosecutors with years on the case couldn't find a crack. And still, Chin stayed small in the public eye. He lived with his mother, let her answer the door, sat in the same armchair for hours while feds parked outside. To them, he was a curiosity, a footnote in a case that never quite came together. But to those on the inside, he was feared, because behind that dazed stare was a memory that held everything and forgot nothing. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno watched the pressure grow. He could sense that something was approaching, though no word had yet confirmed it. He hadn't lost his touch, he had simply lost time to correct men who had already made up their minds. Caponigro's ambition wasn't loud, but it was gathering weight. More men stood behind him now, not with open rebellion, but with readiness, waiting for a sign, a moment. Bruno stayed the course. He refused to act without clarity. He continued to meet with his allies in New York. Chin's name came up often, not in gossip, but in quiet admiration. Men were beginning to wonder who would carry the old ways forward when the old men were gone. Chin was patient. Bruno respected that. There was a strange harmony in how they led, both using silence to command obedience, both knowing that visibility was a liability in this life. But where Chin had chosen disguise as his weapon, Bruno had chosen diplomacy. And diplomacy, in a world growing more chaotic by the year, was becoming harder to maintain. Men no longer valued the long game. They wanted returns now, fast money, fast respect, and some had stopped caring who they had to cut out to get there. Still, Bruno believed in the rules. He believed the commission would back him, that the structure would hold. But even in sleep, the mind can sense an approaching tremor, a presence behind the door, a silence that lasts too long. As Chin shuffled through the streets of Manhattan and Bruno sipped espresso in his South Philly kitchen, two different versions of the same story continued to unfold. Men leading from the shadows, surrounded by loyalty, haunted by betrayal. Neither knew it yet, but a decision in one city would soon echo in the other. And for now, both cities slept, watchful, waiting, unaware of what was beginning to move beneath the surface. Chapter 10: The Hand That Moves the Blade. By the spring of 1979, Philadelphia's sidewalks warmed beneath the soft breath of April. The corner stores had opened their windows again, the smell of baking bread drifting past street corners where old men played cards and teenagers lingered by stoops. But behind the peace, something cold was taking shape, something calculated. Angelo Bruno moved as he always had, without hurry, without fear. He still dressed in simple suits, still greeted neighbors with a slight nod, still kept his movements unremarkable. But the city no longer responded to him the same way. His authority held, but its edges had dulled, not because he'd lost his strength, but because others had started to forget why it mattered. Tony Caponigro had been working, not loudly, not carelessly, but steadily. He had traveled to New York more often than before, met with men he had no business meeting, pitched ideas, whispered doubts. He believed Angelo's time had passed, that the commission might be persuaded to look the other way if the old man was removed quietly, that Philadelphia could become more than a sleepy city of gambling and shy extortion. Heroin was the future, he claimed. All it needed was a boss willing to open the gates. But he never got the full green light. Caponigro misread the silence. In a world ruled by subtle gestures and half-spoken truths, silence is not always approval. Sometimes it is a warning. But Tony had waited long enough. And now he made his decision. The blade was ready. All that remained was the hand to guide it. Bruno, for his part, had no idea how close the knife was. He suspected unrest. He had heard the footsteps, seen the way some men turned their eyes at meetings, but betrayal is rarely declared in this life. It arrives in the space between two breaths, in the calm just before the door opens. Vincent Gigante, hundreds and miles away, remained removed from the drama, but he heard of it. His people were in the loop. Word moved fast through the corridors of the five families. New York was paying close attention. If Bruno was taken down without approval, if the commission structure was ignored, the whole system could tremble. But Caponigro believed he could manage the aftermath, that with Bruno gone, he could step in, clean up, and pay tribute forward. He believed he could explain it, package it, sell it. And in his arrogance, he forgot the thing Bruno had always understood best. There are rules, and breaking them costs more than money. On March 21st, 1980, the streets of South Philadelphia were quiet. Bruno had just returned home from a routine visit to a neighborhood restaurant, the kind of place he had eaten at for years. He got into the passenger side of his car, trusted driver at the wheel, engine running. The shot came quickly, close range. A single moment of silence broken, then silence again. Bruno slumped gently in his seat, his last breath quiet, his body still. There was no dramatic chase, no shouted names, only the sound of the night continuing around him. The city didn't even realize at first what had been lost. A boss was gone. The gentle Don had fallen, not in war, but in betrayal. And in the hours that followed, a ripple began to spread. From one city to another, from Philadelphia's quiet corners to the iron corridors of New York, Angelo Bruno was dead, and the rules had been broken. Chapter 11. The Cost of Unspoken Rules. The news moved slowly at first. A body in a car. A man known for his smile, now silent beneath the city he once ruled. Police gathered under dim street lamps. Neighbors watched from porches, confused, hushed. Some whispered the name, unsure if it was real, but by morning the truth had crystallized like frost on a window pane. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, the quiet boss of Philadelphia, was gone. There were no sirens, no screams. The city carried on, almost respectfully. But within the world Bruno had once kept steady. Something came undone. His death wasn't just an execution, it was a violation, not just of trust, but of structure. Caponigro had broken the order, not by killing a man, but by killing a boss, without permission, without ceremony. And in this life, permission was everything. Across the river and into New York, the word arrived like a chill. The commission, composed of the heads of the five families, met behind guarded doors. There were no raised voices, only questions. Who gave the green light? Who knew what and when? Caponigro had moved without their blessing. He believed the reward would be power, but what waited for him was consequence. He appeared calm in those first days. Rumors spread that he had already begun discussing new appointments, realigning the family, telling the story in his way. But beneath that calm, the roots had already begun to rot. New York was not pleased. Carlo Gambino had passed, but his legacy remained strong. The Genovese, the Lucchese, the Colombos, they all watched closely. If this violation stood unanswered, the whole system could collapse. Vincent Gigante, from the shadows of his village residence, understood the moment immediately. Though he stayed silent, though he muttered his usual words in public and wore his worn bathrobe like armor, he felt the tension rise. Bruno had been a stabilizing force, a man who believed in order, in rules. With him gone, the risk of chaos spreading was real. Within weeks, Caponigro's power began to erode. He traveled to New York, seeking audience, seeking to explain. But the faces he met were colder than he expected. There were no embraces, only nods and silence, the same silence he had mistaken for approval. Soon after, he vanished, then reappeared in the most final way a man can, in the trunk of a car in the Bronx, naked, beaten, soap stuffed into his mouth, a message so old it barely needed interpretation. He talked too much. He moved without respect, and now he had paid. The other conspirators followed, bodies found, names erased. Each death a reminder that tradition, even in crime, had boundaries. Bruno's style of leadership, quiet, structured, deliberate, was not weakness. It had been the glue holding something far more volatile together. In Philadelphia, the family staggered. Bruno's allies, those still loyal to his way, looked for new footing. His house remained untouched for days. His widow refused interviews. His children declined questions. The neighborhood grew quiet, as if in mourning not just for the man, but for the calm he had carried with him. And far away, Vincent Gigante watched, a madman to the public, a tactician behind the curtain. He made no public statement, gave no opinion, but inside the Genovese family, he tightened the circle, strengthened the lines of communication, reinforced the rules. He had seen what happened when the old ways were broken, and he would not allow the same mistake to reach him. Chapter 12. A chair without a shadow. The city had changed, not in appearance. The streets still curved the same, the bridges still arched like outstretched arms, but something beneath had shifted. Where Angelo Bruno once stood, a quiet, steady figure, a hollow had formed, and the men who had once looked to that chair now looked to each other, uncertain which voice to follow or which blade to trust. Power, like blood, doesn't stay still. In the vacuum left behind, the Philadelphia family found itself pulled in opposing directions. Some wanted Bruno's rules restored, others wanted something newer, faster, riskier. For a few weeks, the family tried to move forward without a true leader. Money still changed hands, crews still ran their corners, but there was no center, no rhythm, just motion. The commission in New York sent messages, quiet ones. They made it clear, what happened to Bruno had been an offense, not just to a man, but to the entire structure. A boss could not be removed without approval. That lesson had been taught in blood. Now they watched carefully to see who would rise, and how. Phil Tester, Bruno's longtime underboss, stepped forward, calm, careful, not a mirror of Bruno, but a student of his ways. He had no desire to rule with fire. He wanted a return to the stillness, the method. The commission approved his succession, reluctantly. It was a compromise, an attempt to patch the order together. But there were too many cracks now. Caponigro's betrayal had exposed ambitions long hidden. The younger generation had tasted the scent of power, and they weren't eager to return to waiting patiently in line. Violence that had been restrained during Bruno's reign began to surface again, quietly at first, then in louder bursts. Vincent Gigante, still playing the role of madman in Manhattan, read the situation for what it was. He had seen it before, in Harlem, in the Cell, Bronx, in the back alleys of Brooklyn. Once blood was spilled without permission, more would follow. Chin had no interest in Philadelphia beyond its symbolism, but what mattered to him was the structure, the invisible architecture that kept each city in its place. To Chin, Bruno's murder was a warning disguised as a headline, and so he moved inward. He closed his family's doors tighter, strengthened the walls. His inner circle grew even more selective. Orders moved slower, more deliberately. He allowed his madness to take center stage again. Visits to psychiatrists increased. Appearances on sidewalks became more erratic. He wandered into traffic, muttered to mailboxes. The illusion deepened. Yet his businesses never faltered. The money continued to pour in, from clubs, gambling halls, construction sites, waterfront deals. His madness to the outside world remained baffling, but inside his crew no one was confused. The Chin ruled, and he ruled with precision. Bruno had led with dignity. Chin led with illusion. Both kept the peace in their cities, but with Bruno gone, the line between calm and chaos had thinned. In Philadelphia, the calm began to crack, and as Tester tried to steady the family, he knew one thing for certain. He was sitting in a chair still warm with memory, and memory, in this life, could be a dangerous thing. Outside, the streetlights buzzed quietly over the sidewalks. A wind passed through alleyways and bounced off shuttered windows. The city slept, but its dreams were uneasy. Chapter 13. The Quiet Rise of Phil Tester. Phil Tester didn't wear power the same way Bruno had. Where Bruno had been polished and reserved, Tester was heavier in presence. Thick eyebrows, sharp nose, deep voice. They called him the Chicken Man, a nickname from a side business in poultry, but there was nothing soft about him. He understood the streets, the politics, the pressure, and though he admired Bruno's restraint, he knew the time for quiet leadership had passed. The city was restless. The streets had remembered blood. The younger crews had started to taste fast money through drugs, through extortion, through schemes that had no patience for the old ways. Tester tried to rein it in. He offered calm, promised balance, but the trust that Bruno had spent decades building could not be replaced in months. Still, Tester had been chosen. his rise was approved. New York had nodded their slow approval, partly because they saw no better alternative, partly because they hoped he could pull Philadelphia back into order. And for a short while, it seemed to work. Tester brought structure back. He tightened crews, reopened communication with New York, tried to honor the alliances Bruno had protected. But beneath it all, resentment simmered. The men who had supported Caponigro were not all gone. Some had slipped away quietly. Others stayed, smiling thinly, waiting for their moment. And the money, especially the money from heroin, continued to tempt. It poured in faster than the old rackets ever had. Bruno had refused it. Tester hesitated, but others didn't. A new name began to rise. Nicodemo Scarfo, Little Nicky. He had been close to Tester for years, serving under him in Atlantic City, known for his temper, for his ambition. Scarfo didn't just want to make money, he wanted to be feared. Where Bruno had built a reputation for kindness and Tester for steadiness, Scarfo leaned into brutality. He believed fear worked faster than loyalty, and in a city full of shifting allegiances, speed was a currency of its own. Tester kept him close, maybe too close. He believed Scarfo could be managed, directed. But others saw what Tester did not: the ambition, the hunger, the way Scarfo's eyes lingered too long on every room he entered. Meanwhile, in New York, Gigante continued his quiet calculations. Bruno was gone. The next layer of leaders was emerging. Chin had no love for chaos, but he knew how to use it. He kept his ear to the ground in South Philly, listening through intermediaries. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words moved like stone, dropped in still water. Slow, heavy, lasting. His madness routine became even more convincing. He wore slippers in public, waved at invisible people, crossed the street randomly. But in the back rooms of his Greenwich Village sanctuary, he remained sharp. No move was made in his name without purpose. He studied Philadelphia like a chessboard. He knew the names, the loyalties, the tensions. He knew that Tester was trying to hold the line, and he also knew that Scarfo had already started moving pieces of his own. It was only a matter of time. Outside, another winter approached. Snow collected gently on brick ledges and wrought iron gates. Tester watched it from his window, sipping coffee, his mind quietly racing. He had taken the chair, but the shadow that once guarded it was gone. Chapter 14. The seeds beneath the concrete. Phil Tester moved with the weight of history on his shoulders. Bruno's ghost lingered in every meeting, every whispered conversation, every slow nod across a restaurant table. The men who came to him brought both respect and calculation. They smiled, but behind their eyes sat questions. Would Tester rule like Bruno, or fall like Caponigro? He answered with structure, delegation, order. Tester was not flashy. He had no need for grand gestures, but something had shifted in the air. The city no longer moved in one rhythm. It pulsed unevenly now. Some crews still clung to the old rules. Others chased new fortunes, drugs, fast rackets, bigger slices. And through it all, Scarfo waited. Nicodemo Scarfo had been exiled once, sent to Atlantic City because even the old bosses found him too volatile. He carved out a domain there, transforming a seaside resort into a city dripping with skimmed profits and quiet violence. He saw himself not as a follower, but as a force. Tester thought he could manage him, but men like Scarfo don't get managed. They wait, like coiled wire, until the moment to strike. In the shadows of the family, Scarfo found allies, not through charm, but fear. He promised profit, promised movement. While Tester sought peace, Scarfo promised power. He understood that the younger generation didn't want to wait in line. They wanted to leap ahead, and he offered them the ladder. The divide widened. Some still honored Bruno's legacy. Others whispered Scarfo's name as a future no one could avoid. And in this silence, betrayal began to take form, not loudly, but in slow, creeping steps. Phone calls that ended too quickly, meetings behind backs, a lunch skipped, a glance held too long. One man, Peter Casella, had once been loyal to Tester, but Scarfo reached him, drew him in, made promises. Casella had ambition. He believed Tester was too slow, too stuck in the past. Scarfo offered momentum. Together they plotted. Not with rage, but with strategy. They studied Tester's patterns, watched his routines, waited for a moment that felt inevitable. And then came the morning, a Sunday, calm and grey. Tester stepped out of his front door, same as always. The street was quiet, nothing out of place, a morning like any other. But beneath his porch, someone had placed a bomb. When it exploded, it tore through the stillness with a cruel finality. His body was lifted, twisted, dropped. Smoke curled into the cold air. The neighbors rushed out. Screams echoed, and just like that, the chicken man was gone. The city held its breath. Scarfo didn't mourn. Casella didn't speak. The news spread across neighborhoods like ash on the wind. The boss had fallen. Another void had opened, and Scarfo, once in the margins, stepped into the center. In New York, Vincent Gigante sat quietly in his hidden headquarters. The news of Tester's death reached him without emotion. He didn't flinch, didn't pace, just nodded slowly. The world was shifting again. Another piece had been removed from the board. Chin never rushed his moves, but he saw the pattern forming. Bruno had died in betrayal. Tester had followed in fire. Scarfo now stood where both had once ruled, and the structure, fragile, trembling, creaked again under the weight of ambition. Outside, snow melted slowly on the sidewalks. Steam rose from subway grates. The city slept, unaware of the new shadow that had taken hold. Chapter 15, Scarfo's Cold Fire, Nicodemo Little Nicky. Scarfo didn't waste time mourning. The smoke from Phil Tester's assassination had barely cleared before he began carving his path. He didn't wait for consensus, didn't care for approval. He simply moved forward, certain the fear he inspired would be enough to seal his claim. And in time, it was. The commission looked on with hesitation. Scarfo had never been their favorite, but Philadelphia had grown unpredictable, unmanageable. And so, in the absence of alternatives, they gave their quiet approval. Scarfo became the new boss of the Philadelphia crime family. He ruled not with diplomacy, but with dread. If Bruno had been the quiet uncle and Tester the reluctant father, Scarfo was the wolf. Lean, severe, calculating. He trusted no one. Paranoia was his compass. He believed betrayal could come from anywhere, so he acted first. The family, once defined by patience and protocol, now bled in the streets. Friends turned to enemies. Allies vanished. He moved operations further into drugs, heroin, cocaine. The profits exploded. Scarfo didn't just permit it, he fed it. The streets buzzed with money, but it came at a price. Murders spiked, crews fractured. No one felt safe, not even his most loyal captains. Scarfo didn't believe in second chances. If you questioned him, whispered about him, looked at him the wrong way, your days were numbered. In his mind, he was building something pure, clean lines of loyalty, sharp corners of power. Anyone who threatened that symmetry was erased. A dozen men fell in the first year alone. Some were buried with whispers, others with headlines. Scarfo didn't hide. He believed the fear he instilled was as important as the money he made. But fear corrodes. It doesn't build, it hollows. In New York, Vincent Chin Gigante took notice. He never commented directly, but through intermediaries he made his thoughts known. Chin had built his empire through silence, illusion, control. He saw in Scarfo a volatility that couldn't be contained. And that made him dangerous, not just to Philadelphia, but to the entire structure of Cosa Nostra. Still, Chin did not interfere. He had his own house to manage, his own shadows to tend. But he watched. He always watched. Inside the Philadelphia crew, some began to regret what they had allowed. Scarfo's methods made money, but they didn't make peace. Every gathering, every dinner, every conversation was weighed down by a sense of dread. A wrong word could be your last. Scarfo thrived in it. He tightened his inner circle, relied only on a handful of men he trusted, men who feared him enough not to plot, at least not openly. He built fortresses around his operations, surveillance, secret meeting spots, dead drops. He believed the FBI was always listening, always closing in. He wasn't wrong. Agents had been watching for years, but now their attention sharpened. The brutality of Scarfo's reign gave them openings, informants, turncoats, mistakes. Violence draws light, and Scarfo, in all his ruthlessness, had never learned to shade his flame. In the stillness of his Atlantic City home, he would sit at night, drinking espresso, staring out over the shore. He believed he had conquered the city, that he had rebuilt the family in his own image. But the foundation was brittle, built on fear, built on silence, and silence, when it breaks, is deafening. Nicodemo Scarfo ruled with iron and fire, but no kingdom built on fear can stand untouched forever. The very silence that once served him began to tremble beneath the weight of paranoia. Men who had pledged loyalty now looked over their shoulders. Those who had once toasted him began to drink in corners, speaking softly, if at all. A family cannot breathe under constant suffocation. Scarfo didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He doubled down. More rules, tighter operations. Men who once ran the street-level rackets with ease were now under constant scrutiny. Any hint of disobedience was met with swift removal. Bullets, knives, a vanishing. Names were spoken once, then never again. In this tension, the FBI found opportunity. Fear had made men reckless. Careless words slipped in wiretapped calls. Foot soldiers cracked during questioning, and slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to align. The agents watching Scarfo saw not just a criminal empire, but one teetering toward implosion. Scarfo's own people were becoming liabilities. He saw betrayal in every pair of eyes. He even began to question long-standing allies like Frank Monte, his trusted consigliere. Monte was loyal, but loyalty meant little when Scarfo's mind darkened. He became consumed by whispers. One morning, Monte was summoned, and he never returned home. Scarfo later claimed it was justified. The others didn't ask questions. They simply nodded and looked away. The murders mounted. Inside the family, a quiet dread took root. Those who had once dreamed of rising through the ranks now hoped only to survive the month. Even Scarfo's underboss, Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, began to wonder if his position was protection or a target. Outside Philadelphia, the other families watched. Gigante, ever still behind his curtain of madness, had agents in every corridor. Word of Scarfo's internal purges made it to Manhattan. Chin didn't speak of it openly, but his eyes narrowed. Power that draws fire is a threat to all. Chin believed in balance, in illusion. Scarfo's violence wasn't just a local problem. It risked drawing heat on the whole structure. The FBI didn't see isolated crimes. They saw a web, and Scarfo's brutality lit up the map. Yet still, no one moved. Scarfo held power, and power, even dark and brittle, was respected. Meanwhile, another figure began to emerge. Tommy Del Giorno, a capo under Scarfo. Quiet, observant, watching. Del Giorno didn't speak much, but he listened to everything. He saw how quickly loyalty turned into a liability. He understood that Scarfo's kingdom was a house of broken glass, and he began to consider what others were already whispering, that the path forward might not lie in loyalty, but in survival. The FBI had approached him before. He had said no, but things were changing. Men he'd grown up with were vanishing. Allies were reduced to names on newspaper pages. His own future, once steady, now swayed like a loose wire in the wind. And Scarfo, in all his control, couldn't see it, or wouldn't, because Scarfo believed in fear. But he forgot that fear, left unchecked, becomes desperation, and desperate men don't wait for their turn. They choose their moment. They break the silence. Tommy Del Giorno sat in a parked car outside a deli on Passyunk Avenue, steam fogging the windshield as winter breathed across Philadelphia. He had made a dozen collections that morning, the envelopes warm in his pocket, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Scarfo's voice still rang in his ear, sharp, accusing, unpredictable. Tommy had been with the family for decades. He knew the rules, but lately the rules kept changing. He wasn't alone in his unease. Beneath the polished calm of dinner meetings and club conversations, a current of fear ran like an underground river. Scarfo had killed friends, killed allies, killed men he had once called brothers. The loyalty of yesterday had become irrelevant today, and the truth settled in like dust. No one was safe. Not really. So when the FBI knocked again, Del Giorno didn't slam the door. He listened, quietly, cautiously. They didn't press too hard. They didn't need to. They showed him photos, names, timelines. They reminded him of Monte, of Frank Narducci, of Salvatore Testa, men who'd been fixtures, and then, one day, were gone. The message was clear: stay and sink, or talk and walk. Del Giorno didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He drove home through the wet streets, headlights bending off puddles and windows. At red lights, he watched the sidewalks for faces. Paranoia had crept into his routine. Was that car behind him there yesterday? Did that man cross the street twice? He had become a man split in two, one side moving envelopes, the other calculating exits. And the FBI waited, patient, persistent. Back in New York, Vincent Gigante received word of the shifting winds in Philadelphia. He listened without speaking, his eyes steady beneath a worn bathrobe. He said nothing, but those around him understood. Scarfo's foundation was cracking, and when one pillar falls, the whole structure groans. Still, Chin didn't move. He never did until the silence broke. In Philadelphia, that silence was thinning. Frank Martinez, a lower-level associate, was arrested on a weapons charge. A minor case, on paper, but he didn't want to serve time. He didn't want to become the next body in the Delaware, so he gave names, places, habits. The Bureau opened a new file. Another informant joined the board, then another and another. Del Giorno, still uncommitted, saw the names leaking, saw the walls begin to hum with listening devices. The streets were no longer safe. The clubs, the coffee shops, even the funeral homes. They were being watched. The FBI wasn't knocking anymore, they were already inside. Scarfo, meanwhile, grew more erratic. He sensed movement but couldn't trace the source. He tightened his circle again. More men disappeared. The family shrank not from war, but from internal fire, and in that shrinkage, the Bureau saw their moment. Tommy Del Giorno called the agents one afternoon. His voice was calm, no theatrics, no fear, just a man who'd had enough of dying friends and shifting rules. He agreed to cooperate, in full. He gave them names, hierarchies, drop points, murder plots. His mind was a vault, and now it stood open. The FBI began drafting indictments with confidence. What they once guessed, they now confirmed. Scarfo never saw it coming, and maybe that was the point. He ruled by fear, but forgot that even the most loyal dog will jump the fence if you starve it too long. And now, the fence had a hole. The quiet had been broken. The folders were thick, lined with statements, dates, photos, diagrams. Across the FBI's Philadelphia division, fluorescent lights glowed into the late hours as agents sifted through every word Tommy Del Giorno had given them. He hadn't held back. Over months he painted a complete picture, anatomy of a crime family that had once moved in the shadows, now exposed under the hard light of law. Scarfo's operations were mapped. Every captain, every soldier, every murder ordered, every extortion route, every loan shark account. Names they had speculated about were now confirmed, hidden rackets traced, meeting spots identified. The picture was no longer a sketch, it was a photograph. In Washington, the Department of Justice gave the green light. The RICO indictments were assembled, precise, deliberate, not just for Scarfo, but for nearly the entire hierarchy of the Philadelphia family, and with each sealed envelope, the fate of an empire shifted. The FBI wanted the arrests swift, synchronized, unmissable, no more whispers. They wanted spectacle, early morning raids, cameras waiting at doorsteps, helicopters above South Philly rooftops, a clear message that the era of blood and silence had ended. Scarfo didn't know the exact day, but he felt the tremors. He tightened his security, changed safe houses, moved meetings to the Jersey Shore. But he couldn't escape the net that had been slowly closing for years. He had built his kingdom like a cage, and now the bars were locking shut from the outside. On the morning of the arrests, agents fanned across the city, knocked down doors, pulled men from bedrooms, from diners, from funeral homes. Scarfo was taken from an apartment near Atlantic City, his face tight with disbelief, lips sealed. He asked no questions, offered no fight. He knew. In total, 17 key members of the Philadelphia crime family were taken in that sweep. The fortunes. Headlines were instant. Scarfo indicted in sweeping mob crackdown. Philadelphia crime family dismantled. Newspapers called it the end of an era, the beginning of a new chapter for a city long scarred by gangland blood. But beneath the surface, something deeper stirred. Vincent Gigante read the reports in his Manhattan apartment. He sat quietly, bathrobe draped across his thin shoulders, slippers silent on the tiled floor. He read every name, every charge, and said nothing. His face gave nothing away. But those closest to him knew. Scarfo's fall wasn't just Scarfo's, it shook the tree. If Philadelphia's house could collapse, so could others. The feds were getting smarter, bolder, more patient. They were listening longer, watching from deeper shadows, and men like Chin, men who survived on invisibility, would need to become even more cautious. Back in Philadelphia, the remaining ranks scrambled. Those not indicted tried to regroup, but without Scarfo, without a hierarchy, the structure groaned under its own weight. Younger soldiers questioned orders. Older ones considered retirement. The vacuum was dangerous, and everyone knew it wouldn't remain empty for long. Scarfo, now locked away, refused cooperation. He still saw himself as boss. Believed silence was power, but power behind bars loses its bite, and silence no longer protected those on the outside. With Del Giorno and others flipping, the floodgates opened. Dozens more arrests followed in the months ahead. The dominoes didn't fall, they collapsed. In the quiet corners of the city, old-timers shook their heads. They remembered Bruno, remembered the days of soft diplomacy, controlled money, and blood kept off the streets. That world was gone now, replaced by noise, fear, and a generation raised on bullets rather than bonds. And in that wreckage, eyes turned back to New York, to the man who walked in robes and mumbled to himself. The man who had outlasted nearly every rival. The Chin, still standing, still listening, still invisible. Washington Square was quiet that morning. Pigeons gathered by the fountain, their soft wings rustling like whispers. Just beyond the park, in the brownstone-lined maze of Greenwich Village, Vincent Gigante walked slowly down Sullivan Street. Slippers shuffled, bathrobe cinched, a cigar sat unlit between his fingers. He mumbled softly to himself, head tilted down, as though listening to voices only he could hear. Neighbors saw him daily. Some offered nods, others ignored him. To the outside world, the Chin was a ghost, harmless, eccentric, perhaps even broken by the years. But those within the commission knew better. Gigante's madness was not weakness, it was strategy. In the 1980s, as the FBI tore through mob families from coast to coast, Chin Gigante remained untouched, not because he lacked power, but because no one could prove he held it. His mental illness, documented and witnessed, created the perfect legal fog. While prosecutors prepared RICO cases against bosses like Gotti, Persico, and Scarfo, Chin was dismissed as unfit for trial, unfit for leadership, unfit even for questioning. But the Genovese family knew who sat at the top. Underbosses passed messages in whispers. Capos waited for nods from intermediaries. Orders were given not by phone, but through in-person gestures, handwritten scraps, and face-to-face meetings in corners of old bakeries or behind church pews. Every decision passed through Chin's trusted concierge system. Men like Dominic Cirillo, a soft-spoken operator with clean suits and a sharper mind. Cirillo carried Chin's words like scripture, careful not to overstep, careful to never place his boss too close to anything actionable. Chin watched the world change from his quiet corner. He saw the fall of the Philadelphia crew. He saw the heat rise against the Gambinos. He noted how Gotti, with his flash and press photos, had become a symbol of defiance and a magnet for attention. Chin wanted none of it. He believed in invisibility. He believed in fear that came not from bullets, but from mystery, and that's how he held power. His orders weren't shouted, they were murmured. His presence wasn't seen in nightclubs, it was felt in empty chairs and lowered voices. While other bosses courted loyalty with gifts and threats, Chin offered longevity, protection through silence. He funded soup kitchens quietly, supported families of fallen soldiers, never drew public anger, never gave the tabloids a face to chase. If he had to settle a score, it was done without spectacle. A man would disappear or suffer a quiet heart attack in the dark. No screaming, no headlines. Even the commission, diminished and wary, respected his approach. When they gathered, rarely now, they waited for his word. He spoke little, let others argue, But when he did speak, it landed with weight, carefully shaped and softly delivered, like a stone placed in still water. Inside his Greenwich Village home, Chin kept a rotary phone that never rang. A black and white television flickered endlessly in the corner. The walls were bare, save for a crucifix. The apartment felt timeless, untouched by decades. To an outsider, it was a forgotten room in a forgotten city. But from that room, an empire was still ruled, not with fire, not with noise, but with patience, with stillness, with the robe of a madman and the mind of a king. While headlines screamed about Gambino trials and Philadelphia bloodshed, the Genovese family moved in the quiet spaces in between. They didn't claim turf with bullets. They didn't throw parties in public clubs or leave corpses as warnings. Instead, they grew through conversation, through restraint, through knowing who to touch and who to leave untouched. Chin had long believed that violence drew heat, and heat invited collapse. He knew the history. The commission wasn't built on chaos, it was built on diplomacy, on rules, and though the rules were now frayed, Gigante remained a traditionalist. In the 1980s, as Gotti waged war against his own and the DeMeo crew's violence stained New York's memory, Chin looked toward real estate, construction, sanitation, and the unions. The family's influence seeped into the carpenters' union, the longshoremen, the garment district. They didn't take everything, just enough. Skimmed the cream, left the rest. In Harlem, Chin's reach extended through quiet partnerships. In Midtown, his voice echoed through backroom meetings in steakhouses, where politicians, union heads, and financiers all spoke in the same hushed tones. There were no threats, no bravado, just a calm man in a robe somewhere who everyone knew not to cross. Fronts operated without flash. Bookmaking rings were careful, controlled. Loans were extended only to those who understood the cost of delay. And if a debtor couldn't pay, the family didn't always send a bat. Sometimes they sent silence, and silence unsettled more than threats ever could. Dominic Cirillo, Chin's emissary, moved like a diplomat, respectful, measured. When he sat down with other crews or businessmen, they leaned in. They understood he wasn't speaking for himself. He was the mouth of someone who had no face, and his calm was never mistaken for weakness. In Brooklyn, the Genovese family began a quo de courts, hiring interests in small trucking companies. In the Bronx, they quietly merged with local gambling dens and corner numbers runners who no longer felt safe under the crumbling Lucchese umbrella. Even in New Jersey, their reach touched waterfront deals once assumed to belong to other families, not through conquest, but absorption. Chin's men didn't demand territory. They let it drift to them piece by piece as others faltered. No press, no sirens, just quiet expansion. And while the FBI circled Manhattan, tailing Gambino captains and watching Colombo infighting unravel, the Genovese crew stayed largely untouched. Every surveillance operation ran into a wall. No phones, no fingerprints, no slips. Chin's madness acted like a curtain. It deflected suspicion. Prosecutors knew he was in charge, but the medical records worked against them. Psychiatrists testified to his delusions. Nurses recalled his mumbling. He watered plants in the ward, played checkers with himself, all an illusion. And in that illusion, power flourished. One agent referred to the Genovese as the Ivy League of the Mafia. They were disciplined, educated, and untraceable. Chin liked it that way. He didn't want to be the most feared. He wanted to be the most forgotten, because forgotten men don't go to prison, and forgotten families don't fall apart. The FBI had learned from their failures. Chin's strategy had worked for years. Muffled phones, no direct orders, medical records that portrayed him as unfit. But investigators, slow and stubborn, had patience of their own. They stopped looking for loud proof. They started listening for soft patterns. A quiet pattern emerged. Courier movements, meeting places, a strange rhythm between Brooklyn, Manhattan, and certain churches in the Bronx. They noticed men like Dominic Cirillo, James Ida, and others moving through neighborhoods, attending wakes, visiting kitchens with no reason beyond routine. But nothing was routine in Chin's world, and that was the key. The agents began mapping these walks. They logged who visited who, when, and how often. They started using satellite photos, long lenses. They kept their presence muted, watching from rooftops, pretending to fix light poles, leaning into conversations near newsstands. Even then, there were no overt crimes, no bribes exchanged, no threats heard, but the movements built a picture. Like pencil strokes on soft parchment, a portrait began to take shape, not sharp enough to indict, but clear enough to pursue. Inside the Genovese family, a new generation was rising. Some respected the old ways, others grew impatient. Younger soldiers had grown up on the stories of Gotti, flashy suits and public power. They questioned why Chin's name was never spoken aloud, why decisions took days to reach them. They didn't understand the value of distance, of quiet. They didn't see that Chin's power came not from noise, but from the way his absence made others cautious. Some slipped. One soldier bragged in a bar about connections. Another used a wiretapped phone line without clearance. Nothing major, but small cracks, once opened, never resealed completely. Cirillo tried to keep discipline tight. He called emergency sit-downs. He reminded Swans. Ed them of the Chin's rules: no phones, no unnecessary meetings, no greed. He told them that men like Scarfo and Gotti had died behind steel bars or in forgotten hospital beds. He spoke slowly, clearly, not to scare them, but to remind them who they were. Still, the FBI moved forward. They subpoenaed doctors. They interviewed orderlies from psychiatric facilities. Some said Chin was no threat, just an old man playing with a rosary and mumbling Latin. But others, careful with their words, hinted at something different, a deliberate fog, a man who knew when to mumble and when to stop. One nurse recalled seeing a visitor hand Chin a folded note. Chin had glanced at it, nodded, then returned to staring at a turned-off television. It was small, but it made the agents lean closer. By 1990, the FBI had built a quiet case. Not enough to arrest, yet, but enough to circle, enough to tap the right lines, enough to turn attention toward James Ida, who had begun carrying more weight in the family. Chin was aging, even silence can fray with time, and the Bureau was patient. They didn't want just arrests. They wanted to dismantle the last true ghost of the American Mafia. Inside his brownstone, Chin felt the shift. He never said so, but his walks grew shorter, his meetings fewer. Some nights he sat longer near the window, watching the rain trace down the glass. He didn't fear the agents, but he understood inevitability. He had lived long enough to know that even shadows grow heavy when the sun shifts, and now the light was changing, softly, slowly. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so safe. By the early 1990s, the myth of Vincent Gigante had begun to lean against time. The FBI's case, once a scattered map of uncertain whispers and ritual movements, was taking form. A new generation of prosecutors, trained in RICO logic and armed with years of recordings, had grown tired of chasing ghosts. They wanted the Chin, but Gigante still played his part to perfection. He paced the sidewalk near Thompson Street with loose slippers, mumbling softly, robe fluttering like he was lost in yesterday. He wandered into bakeries and forgot why he came, sat on benches for hours with eyes closed, murmuring prayers no one could decipher. Neighbors saw a broken man, but agents, perched in vans and behind hidden cameras, saw a curtain. They knew he wasn't truly mad. They just needed someone to say it under oath. And slowly, they found cracks in the stone. James Ida, who carried Chin's decisions through the ranks, had made the mistake of trust. His meetings had grown more frequent, his steps more predictable. They watched him interact with capos, exchange looks, hand off notes. Surveillance teams began recording low conversations, nothing direct, never anything careless. But in Mafia law, implication often walks with proof. Then came the tapes. One soldier, arrested on a gambling charge, flipped, wore a wire, sat in cars, visited coffee shops, gathered the small pieces, the he said to tell you, the from the old man upstairs, the nods toward the village. He didn't say Chin's name, no one ever did, but prosecutors learned the rhythm, the system. Every phrase was a breadcrumb, every silence an arrow. In 1996, indictments were unsealed. They charged Chin with racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. But more than that, they aimed to destroy the illusion, to finally prove that the robe was a costume, that the bath slippers were props, that for decades a lucid and calculating man had hidden behind layers of fog. Chin's attorneys fought back. They presented years of medical records, expert witnesses, former nurses who swore he didn't know where he was most days. A lifetime of confusion, they claimed, a broken mind no longer tied to reality. They said he talked to statues, hid from his own reflection. But the prosecutors had patience of their own. They showed footage of Gigante directing visitors inside the house, handing them notes, closing the blinds before meetings. They played wiretaps where other men referred to him or the guy in the bathrobe when discussing decisions. They didn't need Chin to speak. His world had spoken for him. And then came Cirillo. Though he hadn't flipped, his withdrawal from the family due to illness left a vacuum, one that investigators filled with surveillance. Meetings became more disorganized. Soldiers grew uneasy. One by one, indictments began to fracture loyalty. Still, Chin denied everything. He attended court hearings in a wheelchair, appearing dazed, confused, whispering Ave Marias under his breath. He seemed oblivious to the legal storm swirling around him, but the court no longer bought the act. He was ruled fit to stand trial, and the trial was set. For a man who had ruled with silence, this was the ultimate punishment. Not prison, not chains, but the stripping away of myth. The bright courtroom lights, the attorneys speaking his name aloud over and over. The veil was lifting, and Chin, once untouchable, was about to be seen. Not as a madman, but as a maestro of invisibility. The courtroom was cold, sterile, not a church, not a clubhouse, no saints on the wall, no flickering votive candles, just hard benches and the scratch of pens. No shadows here, only facts laid out in legal tones, free from loyalty or fear. Vincent Gigante sat in his wheelchair, head tilted, eyes distant, his robe replaced with a grey suit that hung on his frame like borrowed fabric. He muttered to himself, stared down at the floor tiles. To some, he looked lost, but the jury was watching something else. The stillness behind the confusion, the slight nods when names were mentioned, the pauses that seemed too measured, the absence of true madness. The prosecution didn't call him a killer, they called him a conductor. A man who, from his brownstone in Greenwich Village, orchestrated the daily flow of a criminal empire. They described him as a boss who used a mask of lunacy as camouflage. They played tapes where underlings referred to the old man or our friend upstairs. They showed images of James Ida slipping in and out of apartments, meetings followed by disappearances, patterns only someone in control could have sustained for so long. The defense leaned into the decades of madness. A parade of psychiatrists took the stand. They recited diagnoses: paranoid schizophrenia, dementia, delusional behavior. They described episodes where Chin mistook mirrors for windows, where he sat silent for hours, refusing food or water. They told the court that he was not guilty by reason of mental illness, that he was incapable of commanding anything, let alone the Genovese family. But the prosecution had time on its side. They brought in men who had flipped, low-level bookmakers, union reps, a quiet capo who, after his own son's arrest, agreed to talk. He never said Gigante's name, but he spoke about the rules. No phones, no recordings, no mention of the boss. And yet science came, orders were followed, promotions made. Who else, they asked, could have made those calls? The jury listened carefully. Over 3 months, the trial unfolded with the slow, careful weight of history. This wasn't about one murder or one bribe. It was about a man who had become legend, now being pulled into the light. The robe was symbolic now, a costume discarded for court protocol. Chin no longer shuffled along Thompson Street. He sat still, flanked by lawyers, while strangers debated his reality. The verdict came without drama. Guilty, racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The robe hadn't saved him. The muttering no longer protected him. The myth, lovingly crafted for decades, had cracked under testimony and tape. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. At age 69, it was a life sentence by another name, and yet Chin did not speak, not in anger, not in denial, not even when the judge asked if he had anything to say. He sat in that chair like he always had, quiet, eyes down, lips moving just enough to stir curiosity. Was it a prayer? A trick? No one knew. They wheeled him out the way he came in, without a sound, no tears, no resistance, just silence. And for a man like Vincent Chin Gigante, silence had always been the most powerful language of all. In the beginning, prison did not recognize legends. The guards didn't whisper, the inmates didn't bow. There were no couriers, no quiet middlemen, just a number, a bed, a metal door that clanked shut the same way for everyone. Vincent Gigante arrived at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, quietly. His wheelchair rolled across polished concrete. His name was not spoken in reverence here. To the medical staff, he was just another aging inmate, thin, hunched, murmuring soft fragments of a past he wouldn't explain. For a man who had once ruled with silence, the silence of prison was different. It wasn't crafted, it wasn't strategic, it simply hung in the air like stale breath. He spent most of his days alone. Nurses checked in on him. He would nod, or not. He ate little, slept often. Sometimes he would sit at the edge of his bed and stare at the corner of the ceiling for hours, lips moving without sound. At times it was hard to tell if he even knew where he was. But then, quietly, a visitor would come, not a capo, not a soldier, a daughter, a priest, a lawyer, and Chin would lift his eyes, just slightly. He still wouldn't speak, but he saw. And those who saw him, really saw him, understood that he remained intact beneath the shell. His eyes, still sharp beneath half-lowered lids, revealed more than words could. He had lived behind masks for so long that even here, stripped of power, he didn't flinch. The Genovese family continued on without him. James Ida, serving his own sentence. Dominic Cirillo, gone quiet. Others filled the space with less caution. The new generation had different instincts. They watched movies about Gotti and Scarfo, not Bruno and Gigante. They didn't understand the value of invisibility. They didn't learn the rules written in silence. And slowly, the cracks spread. The commission, once a secret council, no longer functioned with the same authority. The government had mapped it, dismantled it, pressured it into the shadows. What Chin had feared for decades was now complete. The age of the invisible Don was over. Inside the facility, Gigante aged faster. His hands trembled, his speech, already quiet, softened into near silence. He moved between waking and sleeping like a ghost gliding through the same grey corridor. He prayed often, not aloud, just a rosary twirled between his fingers, a nod toward heaven, a glance at a ceiling tile. He was not alone, but he was no longer among his kind. Other inmates saw an old man in decline, but his mind remained steady enough to hold one final truth. He had done what few had, ruled the most powerful Mafia family in America from behind curtains and robes. He had outlasted bosses, dodged courtrooms, laughed without smiling at the flashing lights outside his home. And now, at the end of the corridor, there were no cameras, no reporters, no whispers from agents with binoculars. Just time, just silence. And the gentle, inevitable hush of a legend becoming memory. In Philadelphia, years had passed since the gunfire outside Bruno's modest home, but time had not erased the outline of his shadow. On Snyder Avenue, old-timers still nodded in passing when they mentioned his name, voices low out of habit, not fear. He had been gone since 1980, a single shotgun blast at close range, a black Cadillac. The silence that followed was not reverence, it was hesitation, as if the very balance of the streets had been disturbed. Because Bruno had not ruled with fire, he ruled with quiet hands and measured breaths, a smile that warned more than it welcomed, a phone that never rang twice. The new bosses who came after him, Testa, Scarfo, Merlino, they brought the noise. They sought television, clashed with government, the press, and each other. The streets bled in ways they never had under Bruno. Meetings turned to ambushes, families split, wiretaps hummed like radios. Fear returned, not of the Don, but of chaos. And in that chaos, Bruno became something else, a ghost not of violence, but of order. In tapes, his name came up like an old prayer. That's not how Bruno would have done it. Soldiers whispered it. Union men remembered envelopes arriving on time. Even FBI agents admitted, under Bruno, the waters were calm. His house on Snyder was sold long ago, but the brick still holds stories. His favorite restaurant, now under new name and ownership, still gets the occasional knock from a man in a suit with no appetite. And in South Philly, older shopkeepers still remember a time when disputes were settled with phone calls, not bullets. He was called the Gentle Don, but it was not kindness that earned him peace. It was calculation. He understood the value of silence, the power of letting others feel in control. His refusal to enter the narcotics trade was not morality, it was pragmatism. He knew drugs brought heat, and heat melted empires. Those were told. Ho ignored that wisdom met faster ends, and yet Bruno was no saint. His hands had moved money, stolen contracts, silenced rivals. He had nodded once, long ago, and a man disappeared into the Delaware, but he never did it for headlines, never stood in front of a camera, never let his name fly louder than his power. His murder, to this day, remains officially unsolved. But those close to the scene know the weight of betrayal, that it didn't come from across the city or from federal agents, it came from within. A man too patient, a crew too eager, an empire that mistook silence for weakness. But time has a way of polishing the still ones. Bruno's legacy, in the twilight of the American Mafia, feels almost noble, not for what he built, but for what he kept from falling. The calm before the storms of Scarfo, the final breath of an old-world code. Vincent Gigante, ruling from robes. Angelo Bruno, ruling from quiet corners. Two men, both silent, but one vanished in madness, the other into myth. The commission was born in secrecy and built on quiet understanding, not written laws, but sacred rules. 7 families sitting around an invisible table, no turf wars, no public scenes, no blood without permission. And for decades, it worked. Gigante, Bruno, and others held the line, each playing their role with precision, always keeping the balance intact. But as the years passed, and the old men disappeared, some to the grave, some to the cell, some to the silence of retreat, there was no one left to uphold the code. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the remaining members of the commission were either indicted or pushed into retirement. Chin was behind bars. Carmine Persico of the Colombos was locked up too, ruling from a prison cell with letters and whispers. The Gambinos, once led by flashy bosses like Gotti, struggled under the weight of government eyes. The Lucchese's, weakened. The Bananos, fractured from within by FBI infiltration. Philadelphia had long since torn itself apart. The seats at the commission's table sat empty, not officially, but spiritually. What once was a sacred council of equals had become a theoretical structure, more respected in memory than in practice. Meetings still happened, but not with the weight they once carried. No longer binding, no longer revered, just echoes bouncing between the hollowed corners of old social clubs, now turned into cafes, gyms, or shuttered storefronts. Bruno had avoided that fate with quiet wisdom. Chin delayed it with elaborate performance, but the clock had always been ticking. Federal prosecutions had dismantled the rituals. RICO had made association itself a crime. Wiretaps made conversation dangerous. Loyalty faltered as sentences grew longer. The oath of omerta, once sacred, began to fade. The new generation no longer grew up in tenement alleys beside wise guys and bookies. They grew up watching their fat hers taken away in handcuffs. And so, the commission slipped away. Not with a bang, not even a gavel. Just the steady fade of presence. Yet for those who remembered, it remained real, in the stories, in the cautionary tales told in prison yards and basement meetings, in the caution whispered over phone calls that weren't supposed to happen. They spoke of Bruno's restraint, of Gigante's games, of Castellano's dinner, of Gotti's arrogance, of Lucchese's books, of Genovese's silence. Legends in suits now reduced to files and grainy surveillance photos. The men who had once dictated terms from Brooklyn to Chicago now shared space on FBI bulletin boards and dusty bookshelves. And yet, their impact lingers. Because the commission wasn't just a council, it was a culture, a way of thinking, a code of existence. Even as its form dissolved, its essence found new homes, in smaller crews, in scattered neighborhoods, in the quiet men who still wore old suits and never carried phones. A shadow cannot be arrested, a whisper cannot be silenced. And so the commission lives on, not in meetings but in memory, not in orders but in instinct. and in that quiet, Angelo Bruno and Vincent Gigante remain eternal, each a pillar of a time now past, each carrying a piece of an era that slipped into the night with no need for farewell. When the fires burn out, they leave behind embers, small, hot remnants of a once roaring blaze. The American Mafia, in the wake of indictments and betrayals, had become just that, no longer brazen, no longer untouchable, but not gone. In New York, the Genovese family, the Ivy League of organized crime, remained intact, operating like an underground corporation, no boss declared, no flashy underboss flashing rings, just layers of structure, shielding the names at the top from the weight of the street. The chin had taught them well, to vanish behind layers, to operate like a bank with no lobby, quiet, unseen. The Gambinos struggled after Gotti, but by the early 2010s, a new wave emerged. Not men in velvet tracksuits, but lean operators, smarter, less interested in headlines. They knew what Gotti had not, that fame and prison were brothers, so they studied the playbooks of Bruno and Gigante. They traded show for shadows. In Philadelphia, things were more fractured. After Bruno's death, the family never truly stabilized. Scarfo had burned it. Merlino brought too much attention, and the ones who came after, they fought to hold pieces of a city once ruled by calm. Still, even here, remnants endured, bookmakers who remembered the old rules, and crews who kept to back rooms and silence. Elsewhere in Chicago, the outfit had shrunk. Casinos were now legal, the unions now monitored, but old habits die slow, and in some corners, the old handshake still held meaning. Across the country, in Detroit, New England, New Jersey, there were fragments, smaller crews, remnants of once mighty machines. The work had changed, but the instinct remained. They no longer relied on violence. That era was gone. Now it was identity theft, online scams, medical fraud, construction loopholes, cybercrime. The mob had adapted not out of cleverness but necessity. The street had changed, the rules had changed, the faces had changed, but the silence, that stayed. The smart ones looked back to men like Angelo Bruno and Chin Gigante for guidance, even in memory. Bruno's belief in balance, Chin's art of deception. Both had understood the weight of visibility, the cost of ego. They didn't want headlines, they wanted results, and in that sense, they became unlikely mentors to a new, quiet generation. Because power, real power, isn't always loud. It doesn't live in YouTube documentaries or wiretap transcripts. It lives in suggestion, in a glance, in the way a man says, "I'll take care of it," without ever raising his voice. And that kind of power, passed down in stories and whispers, never dies. It just shifts form. The new bosses didn't sit around a table anymore, but they remembered the table. They didn't take oaths under candlelight, but they honored those who had. They didn't read from the rule book, but they had memorized the margins. And somewhere in a dark back office above a pizzeria, an old man with a thick gold ring sits quietly, counting the money, listening to the quiet hum of the city below. He never met Angelo Bruno, never heard Chin Gigante speak. But he walks in their shadows, and knows, without needing to be told, how things used to be. Legacy is not what's written in headlines. It's not what fills the documentaries or FBI case files. It's in what lingers, what shapes the actions of those who never met you, yet live by your example. In that way, Angelo Bruno and Vincent Gigante became something more than gangsters. They became patterns. For Bruno, legacy lived in restraint. He taught that power came not from fear, but from control. That violence was a tool, not a language. That a boss didn't need to shout to be heard. His memory lived not in grand gestures, but in small ones. The way a neighborhood stayed safe. The way a dispute vanished before it ever grew teeth. The way envelopes moved without fanfare. To those who remembered him, he was not just the gentle Don. He was the last to truly believe that business should remain business, never personal, never public. Chin's legacy was more complicated but no less enduring. He played the long game, taught the value of unpredictability. His feigned madness was more than disguise, it was strategy. He turned the law into a confused spectator. He blurred his identity so thoroughly that even within his own ranks, myth became policy. To follow Chin was to follow silence. Every step taken twice, once in shadow, once in fog. For today's underworld, fragmented, modernized, and scattered across digital grids, these men offer a different kind of instruction. Not how to fight, but how to fade. Not how to rise, but how to remain. Because longevity, not brutality, is the rarest currency in their world. Somewhere tonight a crew sits in a suburban basement, dividing earnings from a scam no one outside their circle understands. No brass knuckles, no gunshots, just passwords and accounts. One of them quotes Chin. The best play is the one they never see. Another reminds them, Bruno didn't need a gun to win a war. They weren't alive when either man walked the streets, but the stories were passed down. By fathers, by uncles, by quiet mentors who themselves were shadows of a former world. Legacy in this life is not nostalgia, it's blueprint. And as the cities continue to build over old mob strongholds, turning social clubs into wine bars and hideouts into boutiques, the bricks may change, but the ideas remain. In business, in silence, in the measured smile of a man who knows exactly how to walk away. There are no statues for men like Bruno or Gigante, no ceremonies, no plaques, only stories. And that's enough. Because in this life, stories are more powerful than stones. They are carried further, they are harder to erase, and they speak long after the voices fall quiet. As the years roll forward, the streets remember differently. In Philadelphia, Bruno's old neighborhood has changed. The corners that once whispered now laugh louder. Coffee shops where men once took envelopes now host young professionals on laptops. Yet sometimes an older man will walk those same blocks, eyes half closed, half lost. He remembers the bakery where Bruno met lieutenants, the alley behind the corner shop where messages passed. He remembers how quiet it all was, how smooth. He doesn't tell those stories often, not because they hurt, but because they don't belong to this world anymore. In Greenwich Village, where Chin once roamed, the pace has softened. His stoop is still there, though fewer remember the man in slippers who used to mumble to himself as he wandered by. They thought him strange. Most still do. But a few, those who lived there long enough, recall the cars that always waited down the street, the young men who stood watch, the silence that hung in the air like fog. And in that silence, Chin still lives. Not as a boss, not as a ghost, but as an idea. A reminder that things once worked differently, that power could be worn like a sweater, worn in, faded, but always close to the skin. For the men who came after, there's no blueprint, no formal rules, only fragments. But fragments can build new things if they're held with care. A quiet bookmaker in New Jersey still separates his money with the same precision Bruno once insisted on. A crew leader in Queens teaches his boys not to flash, not to fight over scraps, not to be seen when it isn't necessary. He keeps a small photo of the Chin in a drawer, not out of reverence, but as a compass. Because even in decline, legacy leads. There's a peace that comes in the evening of a life, when the work is done, when the stories no longer need telling, only remembering. And in that dusk, Bruno and Gigante, to sit not as legends, but as men, flawed, brilliant, dangerous, wise, each one a half of a coin, heads and tails of the same old world. Bruno with his belief in order, Chin with his mastery of misdirection. Both understanding, in their own way, that real power doesn't shout. It doesn't announce its arrival. It moves through the room like smoke, quiet, slow, and unforgettable. The night comes gently for men like these, not with fanfare, but with stillness. A final breath drawn with the same caution that shaped a life, and for those who listen closely and carefully, that breath still lingers in the air. In the end, there are no kings, no rulers, no bosses, only men, each shaped by the worlds they built and the shadows they walked through. The streets that once feared them now forget. The voices that once whispered their names now fall quiet. But there is peace in that forgetting, and there is power in the slow fade. Angelo Bruno was buried on a calm spring morning in 1980. The funeral was modest by Mafia standards. No gaudy procession, no gun salute, just a man laid to rest in the same city he once kept under his control, not with fear, but with careful balance. The gentle Don, they called him, and he remained gentle, even in death. Those who came to pay respects did so with quiet eyes. There was no need for speeches. Bruno had spoken in silence his whole life. The silence continued in his absence. Vincent Gigante passed in prison in 2005, having outlived many of his enemies and outwitted most of his observers. Even the FBI eventually admitted they had underestimated him. The man who walked the village in a bathrobe had never been mad, only patient, brilliant, elusive. He died behind bars, but his legend had long since escaped. For those who had known him, Chin was not just a boss, he was a riddle that never quite unraveled, a story that told itself differently every time. Their worlds are gone now. The Mafia isn't what it was. The corner stores are chain coffee shops, the payphones are gone, the codes are different, the streets cleaner, the silence harder to hear, but the rhythm remains. That slow, careful hum beneath the surface, the way a favor is returned with interest, the way respect is given before it's demanded, the way men remember how things were even when they no longer speak of it. That rhythm is a lullaby to those who knew and to those who listen closely. Tonight, somewhere in South Philly, a man closes his shop for the evening. He locks the door. Switches off the sign and glances up the street, out of habit, not fear. He remembers stories his father told him, about Bruno, about the way things used to be run, clean, professional, quiet. In the Bronx, an old priest still prays for the soul of a man who once sat in the back pew, never speaking, always listening. He never confessed, but the priest always knew. And far away in a retirement home no one notices, a frail man with cloudy eyes hums softly to himself. Once long ago he held envelopes. Once he waited outside Chin's club until dawn. Now he waits for sleep. In the hush of that sleep, Bruno and Gigante still walk. Not as ghosts, not as villains, but as echoes. Echoes of a world built on loyalty, silence and shadows. A world that asked for everything and gave back only in pieces. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the breath slows in your chest, you drift through that world, not in fear, but in understanding. The roads are quiet, the doors are closed, the guns are gone, only the stories remain, and the stories are enough. So sleep now, let the past settle like dust, let the streets grow still, let the gentle dawn and the odd father take their final bow beneath the stars. The story is over, the night has come, and peace at last returns.